This is group 13, and this is our Bovine movie dissection and beautiful pictures of Jeremy and our scary cow face. The endocrine system is a system that includes endocrine hormones that help control mood, growth, and development. The way our organs work, metabolism, and reproduction. The endocrine system regulates how much of each hormone is released. The hypothalamus is a small portion of the brain. Its main function is to link the nervous and the endocrine system and manage its hormone through homeostasis. The saber-charismatic master nucleus helps with melatonin and sleep-wake cycles. The preoptic nucleus, the supraoptic nucleus, the arcuate nucleus, and the paraventricular nucleus are here on the hypothalamus. They release corticotropin-releasing hormone, thyroxine-releasing hormone, prolactin-releasing hormone, growth hormone, gonadotropin-releasing hormone, and dopamine. The pituitary, the anterior pituitary, comes from Rathke's pouches. The oral ectoderm has the hypothalamus hypophyseal portal system, which you can see is not in the posterior pituitary. It is a two-capillary bed. The arcuate and the preoptic nuclei innervate on this pituitary, and it releases adrenocorticopic hormone, the thyroid-stimulating hormone, luteinizing hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, growth hormone, and prolactin. And then on the posterior pituitary comes the infundibulum with its nervous tissue, with the paraventricular nucleus and the supraoptic nucleus both innervate here, and they release oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. The thymus is a small gland that produces T cells via thymosin, and the T cells help the immune system. After puberty, the thymus starts to shrink. The testes, the luteinizing hormone, acts on the Leydig cells to create testosterone, and the FSH acts on Sertoli cells to create inhibin. Here you can see that this is a negative feedback loop, and there's also the making of androgens, but you can see it's a negative feedback loop. The ovary works similarly, where LH works on the theca cells to create androgens, and the FSH works on the granulosa cells to make the androgen estrogens. So there's also the making of corpus luteum, progestins, and relaxins. Here in this photo, you can see the small ovary, and you can also see here that this is going to be a negative feedback loop. The adrenal gland is going to be full of cortisol, and that is a glucocorticoid that helps release stress relief. And you can see here again, this is a negative feedback loop, meaning it decreases its own production. And it also releases aldosterone and epinephrine. The pancreas releases insulin and glucagon, and regulation is in the glucagon. If there's a high blood sugar, the pancreas is going to release insulin, and then that's going to stimulate glucose uptake from the blood and stimulates glycogen formation. Due to that rise in blood pressure, there's going to be a release of glucagon, which is going to stimulate glycogen to break down into glucose, and also gluconeogenesis in the liver.
Digestive system. Starting off with the esophagus, it connects the pharynx to the stomach, lined with stratified squamous epithelium. It has both skeletal and smooth muscle portions, and there are 4 layers going from the deepest to the most superficial. They go mucosa, submucosa, muscular layers, and then the serosa. Then we have the rumen, reticulum, omasum, and abomasum. The rumen is the site of microbial fermentation. It occupies the largest part of the abdominal cavity. It has stratified squamous epithelium, and it has the pillae to aid in fermentation. The reticulum has a honeycomb-like structure. It is the cranial in the part of the forestomach, and it sorts large and small food particles. The omasum is where water absorption occurs. It looks like pages in a book, and it has stratified squamous mucus layer with papillae. The abomasum is the true stomach. It's a site of chemical digestion, and it has a folded structure. The sulcus ruminoreticularis is also called the reticular groove. It's an adaptation in nursing ruminants. Because milk does not need to undergo microbial fermentation, it allows it to bypass the rumen via the reticular groove. Mucosa region of the cardia forms 2 muscular folds to create the groove, which extends from the cardia to the omasum. The muscles of the groove are stimulated by the act of suckling and contract to form the groove. The duodenum, liver, and pancreas. The duodenum is the first part of the small intestine, and it's where absorption begins. The liver is the largest gland in the body. It's caudal to the diaphragm on the right side, and it secretes bile. The pancreas releases digestive enzymes into the duodenum, and it has serous glands. The gallbladder is a storage sac for bile secreted by the liver. It concentrates the bile, and then the gallbladder can release bile when it contracts, which is stimulated by cholecystokinin. The pylorus is a region of the stomach closest to the small intestines, and it opens into the duodenum with the pyloric sphincter. The hepatic duct and cystic duct are the ducts that form the biliary system. The hepatic duct connects to the liver, and the cystic duct connects to the gallbladder. The common bile duct is a tube that carries bile from the liver and the gallbladder. It goes through the pancreas and ends in the small intestines. Then there are the main and accessory pancreatic ducts. The main pancreatic duct joins the pancreas to the common bile duct, and it provides pancreatic enzymes. The accessory pancreatic duct acts as a drainage for the main pancreatic duct. Then the ampulla of Vater acts as a reservoir for pancreatic juices and bile. It also acts as a network between areas of the digestive system to transport the pancreatic juices and bile. The sphincter of Oddi is a muscular valve surrounding the exit of the common bile duct and the pancreatic duct. It usually remains closed. It's stimulated by a meal, and it lets pancreatic and digestive juices enter the duodenum to begin digestion. The jejunum and ileum are sections of the small intestine where nutrient absorption occurs. The jejunum is the middle portion, which comes right after the duodenum, and then the ileum is the final portion of the small intestine, and it leads into the colon, which is the large intestine. Then you have the cecum, colon, and rectum. The cecum is found at the beginning of the large intestine. It is where water absorption occurs, and it's not as prominent in cattle as it is in horses. The colon is the large intestine, and it's where most of the water absorption occurs. Then the rectum is the final segment of the large intestine, and it leads into the anus. Finally, we have the peritoneum, which is a serous membrane that lines the abdominal cavity. It covers the abdominal organs, which includes the digestive system.
The urinary system, which works to store and separate urine from the blood. First, we're going to talk about the kidney, which in this photo from our dissection, you can see the multiloberness, and it is a multilobar, and you can see the lobes here. Then if we cut a kidney in half, which we did not do during our dissection, but you can see particularly here that you can see the cortex, which is the outer layer, and the medulla, that is the inner layer. Inside the medulla, you can see your major and minor calyxes, which are going to function to surround the papillae of each renal pelvis. These renal pelvises are these little triangular shapes. You can see the nephron here, and this is where blood and urine are separated, specifically in this loop of Henle here of the nephron. There's also the renal pelvis, which is going to be about here in the kidney or about here in this helix area. These are going to connect to the ureters. Here in this photo, you can see this ureter. It's just connected here, and these are basically just tubes that carry urine from the kidneys into the bladder. The ureters are connected to the bladder, and here you can see the bladder. The bladder is transitional epithelium so that the bladder can extend to hold more bladder. It is the site and the temporary holding place for the urine. In this photo here, you can see number 5 located here. That is going to be our left kidney, and 6 here is going to be our urinary bladder. You can see it is right above the urinary bladder because it's going to connect, as shown in this photo, the kidneys to our ureters directly to our bladder.
The circulatory system pumps blood throughout the body to transport necessary nutrients, gases, hormones, and more to maintain homeostasis. The main organ of the circulatory system is the heart. It has 4 chambers: the right atrium, the right ventricle, the left atrium, and the left ventricle. Other important parts of the apex, which is the bottom left tip, the ventricular septum, which separates the 2 ventricles, and the chordae tendineae, which is attached to the papillae muscles and the valves. It closes the valves. There are 4 valves: the tricuspid, bicuspid valves, and the 2 semilunar valves, the pulmonary and aortic valves. The valves are meant to prevent blood from flowing backwards. On the aorta, there's the aortic arch where many different arteries branch off of. There's also the coronary arteries which branch off and bring blood to the heart itself. The brachiocephalic trunk branches off the aortic arch and brings blood to the cranial part of the animal. The pulmonary trunk is part of the pulmonary artery before it splits. There's the celiac artery, which transports oxygenated blood to the stomach, spleen, and hepatic artery, which leads to the liver. Then there's the mesenteric artery, which takes blood to the stomach. The portal vein transports deoxygenated but nutrient-rich blood from the stomach and spleen to the liver to be filtered, and then the hepatic vein takes filtered blood from the liver back to the heart. All blood arriving to the heart goes into the caudal or cranial vena cava, where it dumps it into the right atrium. The pericardium is a membrane surrounding the heart that has fluid to reduce friction. It has the visceral and parietal layers. In overall circulation, blood from the vena cava goes into the right atrium, passes the tricuspid valve into the right ventricle, passes the pulmonary valve, and goes into the pulmonary artery where it gets oxygenated at the lungs, and then goes back, passes into the left atrium, passes the bicuspid valve, goes into the left ventricle, passes the aortic valve, goes into the aorta, is taken to the rest of the body, oxygenates the rest of the body, and then comes back deoxygenated through the veins and goes into the vena cava. In fetal circulation, there are some changes made. The ductus venosus allows blood to skip filtration in the liver. It becomes the ligamentum venosum. The foraminal valley allows blood to pass from right atrium to left atrium, skipping pulmonary circulation. And there's the ductus arteriosus, which allows blood to go from the pulmonary artery to the aorta, skipping pulmonary circulation as well. It becomes the ligamentum arteriosum. Blood comes from the mother through the umbilical veins and leads to the umbilical artery.
Next, we're going to talk about the male reproductive system. The scrotum is the sac that contains the testes and the epididymis. It is kept at a lower temperature than the rest of the body for spermatogenesis. And the tunica dartos is a muscle in the scrotum that regulates temperature by contracting when the outside temperatures become colder. The parietal vaginal tunic is the outermost layer of the testes and spermatic cord and the innermost layer of the scrotum. The visceral vaginal tunic is the layer closest to the testes. These form when the testes descend through the abdomen and the inguinal canal into the scrotum. The epididymis is where spermatids are matured and are stored. After spermatogenesis, the spermatids enter the head of the epididymis and travel to the tail. They gain the ability to swim, and once spermiogenesis occurs, they become spermatozoa. When ejaculation occurs, the spermatozoa travel back up through the epididymis and into the ductus deferens. The spermatic cord forms a connection between the abdominal cavity and the scrotum, and it contains the pampiniform plexus and ductus deferens. The pampiniform plexus is a method of temperature regulation in the scrotum. Arteries carry cooler blood from the testes to the body, and veins carry warmer blood from the body to the testes. Heat is transferred from the veins to the arteries, preserving the lower temperature of the scrotum. And much like the loop of Henle, this is also a countercurrent mechanism. The ductus deferens transports sperm from the epididymis to the urethra. The sigmoid flexure is the S-shaped curve found in the fibroelastic penis when it is retracted into the body. When the retractor penis muscles relax, the penis will fully extend and the sigmoid flexure will disappear. The shaft is the main body of the penis. The glans penis is where the urethra opens, and it is where pre-ejaculate fluid, sperm, and urine exit the body. The urethra is the tube that carries materials of both the urinary and reproductive systems. It has a transitional epithelium, which transitions to pseudostratified or stratified columnar epithelium to stratified squamous as you move closer to the orifice, and it can be voluntarily controlled by the urethralis muscle. So next up, we're going to move on to the female reproductive tract. The vulva is the most innermost part of the female tract. It contains the inner and outer lips, or labia, the clitoris, which is analogous to the penis, and the vestibule. The vestibule is a shared area between the urinary and reproductive tracts. It also contains the constrictor vulvae muscles, which provide closure to the vulvae and prevents poop from entering the vagina. Next up, we have the vagina, which is the first internal part of the female reproductive tract. It receives the penis during sexual intercourse and holds the sperm until they pass through the cervix. The cervix is the canal that connects the uterus and the vagina. It provides a barrier for sperm to pass through in order to reach the oocyte, and during pregnancy, it will create a seal that prevents material from exiting the uterus and will maintain the fetus. And as you can see in this picture here, the cow cervix is marked by 2 to 3 cervical rings. Next up, we have the uterus, which is the site of fetal development. Cows have a bicornuate uterus, which means they have one uterine body and 2 uterine horns. The uterus also has 3 layers: the endometrium, which is the deepest layer, and it's the lining of the uterus and where the oocyte attaches. The myometrium is the muscular layer, and this is where contractions occur, and the perimetrium is the most superficial layer and provides lubrication. Next up, we have the ovary, which is where the oocyte is released from after completing oogenesis and folliculogenesis. After ovulation, the corpus luteum forms and will stimulate progesterone production. If there is no pregnancy, the corpus luteum will die, and estrogen production will resume. The oviduct is the pathway from the ovary to the uterus. The first region of the oviduct is the infundibulum, which can be found here in this picture. It catches the oocyte after ovulation with its fimbria, which are finger-like projections. Then you move on to the ampulla, which is the region where fertilization occurs, and the isthmus, which contains the uterotubral junction, which is where the oviduct meets the uterus. The oviduct also has peg cells, which line the oviduct and capacitate spermatozoa and provide nutrients for the oocyte. And the oviduct is lined by a simple columnar epithelium with cilia. The antral follicle is the last stage in folliculogenesis. It contains genetic material, columnar granulosa cells, a basement membrane, a zona pellucida, theca cells, and the antrum, which is a fluid-filled cavity. And only the dominant antral follicle will be ovulated. Next up, you have the broad ligament, which is made of serous membrane. It connects the side of the uterus to the walls of the pelvis. It suspends the internal organs of the tract.
Discussing the nervous system. So to introduce, starting with the central nervous system, which relates to the spinal and brain portions of the nervous system and includes the cerebrum, which is the large portion of the brain and functions as regulator and temperature and coordinator of movement, and the cerebellum, which controls balance and other complex motor functions. A membrane that covers this brain and the spinal cord is the meninges and includes 3 different layers, and a layer that is also derived from the dura mater called the tentorium cerebelli, which separates the cerebellum and the occipital lobe and covers the cerebellum and brainstem like a tent to protect it from the heavier portion of the brain. Next, we're going to discuss the pituitary gland, which is an endocrine hormone that makes and releases several hormones and controls the function of other secreting glands. It includes 2 different aspects, including the anterior and posterior, and the anterior is formed from Rathke's pouch, and when fully developed, uses the hypothalamo-hypophyseal portal system to release luteinizing hormone, follicle-stimulating hormone, prolactin, ACTH, growth hormone, and thyroid-stimulating hormone. While the posterior pituitary is formed from the infundibulum and releases oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone without a portal system. Next, we're going to discuss the spinal cord, which helps transport and receive connections between the brain and body. It's a lot more complex than that when you split into a cross-section. So the spinal cord consists of 2 different sections, the gray and white matter. The gray includes neural bodies, axon terminals, and dendrites to make up one section, and has 3 different subregions, including the central canal, which is a fluid-filled space that allows transportation of nutrients, the dorsal horn, which is a sensory neuron that receives sensory information, and the ventral horn that functions as a motor neuron and sends out stimuli to signal response. And then there's the white matter, which includes a bundle of axons and makes up the dorsal funiculus,
the lateral funiculus and the ventral funiculus, which includes sensory tracts, motor tracts, and then both sensory and motor tracts. Lastly, we're going to discuss the peripheral nervous system, which is composed of the cranial and spinal nerves that go to and from the somatic or body structures. Two aspects of it, we are going to discuss the brachial plexus and the lumbosacral plexus. Plexus just means a bundle of nerves. So brachial plexus is a bundle of nerves that sends signals from the spinal cord to initiate movement and feeling in the forelimb, while lumbosacral is a bundle of nerves derived from the lumbar and sacral roots and send signals to the hind limb.
So the main function of the respiratory system is the exchange of gases, specifically carbon dioxide and oxygen, to allow the calf to breathe. So oxygen enters the pharynx through either the nasal cavity or the oral cavity, and the epiglottis prevents any food from entering the pharynx and into the lungs and allows the oxygen to go down the right path. Then the glottis is the narrowest part of the larynx, which controls the passageway of air and contains vocal cords, as seen here. The hyoid apparatus supports the pharynx and the larynx and aids in vocal cord functions. The epiglottic cartilage is an elastic cartilage to prevent food from entering the lungs. The thyroid cartilage supports the vocal cords to help create sound, and the arytenoid cartilage articulates with the cricoid cartilage to produce sound from the vocal cord. The trachea carries oxygen that enters the pharynx into the lungs, and it's surrounded by tracheal rings, which are composed of fibroelastic tissue, and they're each attached by annular ligaments. The tracheal rings support the trachea and allow for more flexibility, and inside the trachea is the trachealis muscle, which is a smooth muscle, and its primary function is a constriction of trachea when exhaling. Then the trachea bifurcates into the left and right principal bronchi, and it's bifurcated by the carnea. The principal bronchi brings air into the lungs. So the diaphragm is the main muscle of respiration. When inhaling, it expands the volume of the thoracic cavity to allow more air into the lungs, and exhaling, it decreases the volume to get air out. It also allows passageway for structures from the thoracic cavity to the abdomen, as seen here. So we have the esophageal hiatus, which is an opening in the diaphragm that allows the esophagus and vagal trunks to pass through. The aortic hiatus allows the aorta and thoracic duct to pass through, and the vena cava hiatus allows the inferior vena cava to pass through. The visceral and parietal pleura are used as protection and cushioning for the lungs. The visceral pleura surrounds the lungs, the parietal pleura surrounds the chest cavity, and between the two is pleural fluid, which acts as lubricant between the two layers to prevent friction when breathing. And finally, in the lungs, we have bronchioles and alveoli. The bronchioles lead into the alveoli, which is where the main gas exchange occurs. So oxygen enters the bloodstream and carbon dioxide exits. And also here we have the lung float test. The lungs sank, which means that the calf never took the first breath, which means the oxygen never reached the alveoli, so therefore it sank.
So now we're going to talk about the muscles of respiration. The diaphragm. During inhalation, the diaphragm contracts, increasing the volume of the thoracic cavity, giving it a lower pressure than that of the atmosphere, which moves air into the lungs. And this is an active process, so it requires energy. During exhalation, the diaphragm relaxes, decreasing the volume of the thoracic cavity, giving it a higher pressure than that of the atmosphere, and pushes air out of the lungs. It originates in the lumbar vertebrae and the xiphoid process and inserts into the central tendon, and it is labeled here in this picture. The external intercostal muscles contract during forced respiration and moves the ribs upward and forward. The fibers are directed ventral to caudal. The internal intercostal muscles are also involved in forced respiration, and the fibers run caudal to ventral.
Muscles of the head. You have the masseter, which has the origin at the maxilla and zygomatic arch, and this insertion at the lateral aspect of the mandible. The functions that contraction closes the jaw and relaxation opens the jaw. Then you have the pterygoides, which has its origin at the pterygoid bone, the insertion at the medial mandible, and the functions that when the left pterygoides contracts, the jaw moves left, and the opposite jaw moves. And then you have the temporalis, the origin is the temporal fossa, its insertion is the cornoid process of the mandible, and the functions that it closes a jaw. And then you have the digastricus muscle, which has the origin at the caudal to the temporomandibular joint, and insertion at the medial mandible, the functions that pushes the jaw open. And then you have the mylohyoides, which has origin insertion at the two rami of the mandible, and then its function is it forms the floor of the oral cavity. And then you have the genioglossus, which has origin at the rostromandible, and its insertion at the base of the tongue, the functions that extends the tongue. Then you have the hyoglossus, which has its origin at the hyoid apparatus and insertion at the base of the tongue. Its functions retracts the tongue into the oral cavity. Next, you have the orbicularis oculi. The origin is the nasal part of the frontal bone, the frontal process of the maxilla and lacrimal. The insertion is the skin of the orbital region. The function is the contraction closes the eye. Then you have the orbicularis oris, origins and medial aspects of the maxilla and mandible, and the preoral skin, the muscles, and the insertion is the skin and mucous membrane of the lips, and the functions that it closes the lips. And then you have the levator lobi superioris, its origins in between the nares, its insertion is the upper lip, and then the functions that it pulls the upper lip.
And then you have the levator nasala bialis. Its origin is the upper surface of the skull above the eye, and its insertion is nose and angle of the lips. The function is that contraction pulls the nerves in the edges of the lips. And then you have the caninus, which has its origin at the maxilla, and the insertion coming from the region of the maxilla to the lateral aspect of the nares. The function is that it pulls the nares and flares the nostrils. Then you have zygomaticus. Its origin is that it's attached to the epimysium of the masseter muscle and the angle of the mouth, and its insertion is the angle of the lips. And the function is that contraction pulls the lips laterally. And then you have the buccinator, which has its origin that extends from the aspects of the maxilla and mandible, and its insertion is the mandible maxilla, and the function is that it serves to move the food between the teeth and the tongue. Muscles of the abdomen. So you have the obliquus externus abdominis, which has its origin in the rim and insertion at the brim of the pelvis, linea alba tubercocci. The function is that it has the internal abdominal oblique and transversus abdominis, and it comprises the lateral abdominal muscles. Next, you have the internal abdominis, which is origin as tubercocci, the insertion at the caudal ribs, and its function is it compresses the abdominal viscera. Next, you have the transversus abdominis, which has its origin at the tubercocci and costal cartilage, and its insertion at the linea alba and xiphoid process. Its function is it compresses the abdominal viscera. Next, you have the rectus abdominis, which has its origin at the costal cartilage, its insertion at the brim of the pelvis, and its function is it compresses the abdominal viscera and flexes the spine.
Muscles of the forelimb. The trapezius and the rhomboideus are pictured here. The trapezius is located superficially on the scapular base and originates on the ligaments of the dorsal midlimb and inserts on the scapular spine. It functions to stabilize and move the scapula. The rhomboideus is located deep to the trapezius, originates on the ligaments of the dorsal midlimb and inserts on the scapular cartilages. Its function is to retract abduction and adduction of the forelimb. The latissimus dorsi is the spinosus process of the thoracic and the lumbar vertebrae. It inserts on the medial humerus, and it functions to move the humerus posteriorly and dorsally. The serratus ventralis originates on the caudal, cervical, and cranial aspects of the thoracic cavity and the ribs. It inserts on the medial scapula, and its function is to suspend the thorax between the forelimb. The scapula is pulled laterally to reveal the serratus ventralis. The supraspinatus and infraspinatus effuses to locate the scapular spine. It locates on the left side of the scapular spine. It originates on the spinosus fossa of the scapula and inserts on the humerus. It functions as the shoulder joint, abduction of the forelimb. And the infraspinatus is located on the right side of the scapular spine. It originates on the infraspinatus fossa of the scapula, inserts on the humerus, and it functions out rotator and the abduction of the humerus and the flexor extensor of the shoulder joint. The subscapularis originates on the subscapular fossa, inserts the medial humerus, and its function is to adduct and extend the shoulder joint and move the humerus forward and aids in maintaining flexion. Biceps brachii and the triceps brachii originate. The biceps originates on the supraglenoid and tubercle of the scapula, inserts on the cranial aspect of the proximal radius and the ulna, and its function is deflection of the forelimb. The triceps brachii originates on the caudal border of the scapular proximal humerus, and it inserts on the crown process of the ulna. It functions as extension of the forelimb. Lastly, the pectoralis, which is located pectoralis minor and pectoralis major, and it's located on the cranial sternum. Originates on the cranial sternum, costal cartilages, and the ribs. Insertion on the cranial medial humerus, and it functions as adduction and rotation of the forelimb.
Muscles of the pelvic limb include the biceps femoris. Its origin is the patella ligament, patella and tibia. It inserts into the ischial tuber. Its function is the extension of the hip and stifle, and flexion of the stifle and extension of the hock. The gluteus medius origin is the tuber coccyx. It inserts into the greater trochanter of the femur. Its function is to move the hip joint, and it's found underneath the biceps femoris. The semimembranosus origin is an ischial tuber. It inserts into the medial distal femur, and its function is the extension of the hip, stifle, and hock. And the semitendinosus origin is also the ischial tuber. It inserts into the cranial tibia, calcaneal tuber, and its function is the extension of the hip and stifle only. The tensor fascia latae's origin is the tuber coccyx. It inserts into the fascia lata, which is seen here. The function is the flexion of the hip and extension of the stifle. The gracilis is the pelvic symphysis. It inserts into the medial aspect of the tibial crest, and its function is involved in the adduction of the hind limb as well. The adductor's origin is the ventral pelvis. It inserts into the medial femur, and its function is adduction of the pelvic limb as well. The quadriceps femoris origin is the proximal femur and body of the ilium. It inserts into the patella, and its function is the extension of the stifle. The gastric meniscus origin is the caudal aspect of femoral condyles. It's this muscle seen here. It inserts into the calcaneal tuber, and its function is to extend the hock joint. The iliopsoas muscle is composed of the psoas major, psoas minor, and iliacus muscles. Their origins are the ventral aspect of lumbar vertebrae, sacrum, and ilium. They insert into the lesser trochanter of the femur, and their function is the flexion of the hip.
We'll be discussing the additional information. So we're beginning with the patella, bone, and stifle joint. So the stifle joint is a synovial joint, which includes a lubrication for easy movement, and is held together by three different bones: the femur, the patella, and the tibia. And so it allows for the flexing and extending of the hind leg. And one of those bones we talked about is the patella, which is a bone that sits at the front of the knee joint and protects the joint. Next, we have the synsarcosis, which refers to a joint joined together through muscle. An example of this is a joint of forelimb and its connection to the body. This connection to the body allows transfer of weight amongst the forelimbs, along with stabilization of the scapula. Next, we have the spleen. which acts as a reservoir for red blood cells. In the case of blood loss, this is also where red blood cells are weeded out to ensure only the young and healthy survive and the older, weaker ones die. Then we have our citations, and that is all we have for you. Thank you.